Hello, everyone. Hi. Thank you all so much for being here tonight on this rainy, cold evening. Really appreciate having everyone here. My name is Mariah Berlinga-Shemchuk, and I am the head of public engagement here at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from Spencer Sunshine and Steve Wasserstrom about Spencer's new book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism: The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege. We will have time after the talk for Q&A, so please do save your questions for the end. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. We have bathrooms straight down this hallway, gendered bathrooms, as well as water fountains. There is a gender-neutral single-stall bathroom on the first floor if you would prefer that. Please do silence your cell phones out of courtesy for the speaker and for your fellow audience members. If you haven't bought your book already, we do have books for sale. They'll be for sale at the end, and I think that Spencer will even sign them if you ask really nicely. And so now, share a little bit more about our speakers and the book that we're going to be hearing about. Aspiring neo-Nazi terrorists have a Bible, James Mason's Siege, which praises terrorism, serial killers, and Charles Manson. Neo-Nazi terrorism and countercultural fascism, based on years of archival work and interviews, documents the origins of Siege for the first time. The book explores a previously overlooked period and unearths the hidden connections between a countercultural clique and violent neo-Nazis, which together have set the template for today's neo-Nazi terrorist underground. Spencer Sunshine, tonight's author, holds a PhD in sociology and has written extensively on the US far right. He has done freelance programming at the Institute for Jewish Research in New York City and has also written for the Southern Poverty Law Center, Daily Beast, The Forward, and Truth Out, and has been translated into numerous languages. Steve Wasserstrom recently retired as the Mel and Izetta Tonkin Professor of Judaic Studies and Humanities at Reed College, where he taught since 1987. He served as the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Distinguished Visiting Professor in Judaic Studies at the College of William and Mary, and as an invited scholar at the Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturforschung in Berlin. So thank you all again for being here tonight. Spencer and Steve are really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you all for coming. Steve sent me an email like 3 days ago saying only 7 people had registered for the talk. So I was like, holy shit. So I don't know how or why you all got here. You're just waiting to buy tickets. Or people got over the shock of Trump. And I felt like at least online got over the shock of Trump and are ready to move to the next step. I can tell you I moved on Blue Sky from like 800 to 8,000 followers. So it's fun to get off the white supremacist platform Twitter, which I've been on, I got locked into, but I think it's good people want to now go move to do things. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my book and its relationship to Portland. The book, and I'm going to tell you this because the talk will make some things make more sense. The book is based around James Mason's archive at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. He has 60 boxes of letters. He was an insider in the neo-Nazi movement, ranging from 1966 or something to 2003. And I spent 5 years reading these letters and the other materials he had deposited there and other stuff to write. So I tell you that just because I refer to the letters. So a lot of people know about the history of Nazi skinheads in Portland in the 80s and 90s, about Tom Metzger, and about the murder of Mulugeta Sorrell. Everyone can hear me? Is this good? Too loud? Just making sure. But tonight what I'm going to do is talk about something different. Although it was going on at the same time and there was a limited amount of crossover with Metzger and his Nazis. But this was something more subtle, more sophisticated, and far more accepted by the city's cultural mainstream. The story involves a number of counterculturalists who lived in Portland and had a part in promoting, directly and indirectly, neo-Nazi terrorism, and who were, in turn, feted and defended by numerous sycophants, collaborators, and apologists in Portland. This all allowed these fascist counterculturalists to function openly in the city, to become popular figures, and to have a much greater influence than they could have ever had without this help. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about here has to do with, as we said, a book called Siege, written by the neo-Nazi James Mason. Siege is one of these unusual cases in which a single ideological text drives a movement. Academics love to make this claim about books, but in this case it actually is mostly true. So in this case, it's a canonical book for a wing of neo-Nazism which openly advocates terrorism, both real and aspiring terrorists. Siege rejects legal political actions and advocates not just guerrilla warfare, but racially based lone wolf attacks, mass murder, and riots, and it praises Charles Manson as the new neo-Nazi guru. Several groups base their ideology on the book, best known of which is the Atomwaffen Division, a group that's been linked to 5 murders, including that of Blaise Bernstein in California, who was a gay Jewish man. All the members of Atomwaffen were required to, as the hashtag goes, read Siege, and one described it as their Bible. Now, more generally, this kind of politics is referred to as siege culture, and over the years, numerous other groups have sprung up around the world based on it, and now there's a shifting set of Telegram channels dubbed Terrorism. And if you pay attention to these niche things, two of the main people in the Terrorism collective were just arrested a couple of months ago. All these people follow the doctrine of accelerationism. It advocates collapsing the current political system entirely in hopes of seizing power afterwards and establishing a national socialist state. And the praxis for this is violence, usually in the form of single-actor massacres. We can directly document at least a dozen murders directly linked to Mason siege culture and Terrorism, and there are undoubtedly more. And there are dozens and dozens of neo-Nazis around the world from this milieu who are in prison, and more arrests are happening every day. I pitched an article about Nazi Satanism, and the editor was like, well, I need a news hook. And I'm like, let's just write the article, because it's like every few weeks when these guys is arrested, and we'll just have it ready to go. I'm not joking at all, that's the sad thing. So our story here is going to begin with George Lincoln Rockwell, who founded the American Nazi Party in 1959. And it was important because it was the first open post-war neo-Nazi party that used swastikas, they marched around in uniforms. There had been some other ones, but they were much more subtle than this. And Mason had joined this party in 1966 when he was 14 years old. The next year, that party changed its name, and Rockwell was assassinated. And what happened is that his successor was wildly unpopular, and so about 10 different groups ended up splintering off of this party in the 70s and early 80s. And so what happened then, and I found this out in the book, there's very thin scholarship about this period. There's not a standalone book about Nazism in the United States. If anyone might be working at a major press and wants to give us the money to write. There's not a standalone book about Nazism in the 70s or even much material about it. But I argued, looking through all this stuff, that what happened then set up the template for how the neo-Nazi movement looks today. And these different groups, and part of what I found out, they were all starting to look for what political direction to take, and they started trying out different strategies. And so there was only a few hundred people in the splinter groups, but they did a lot of things that people here, I'm sure, have heard of. So, for example, the splinter group in Chicago started doing grassroots organizing in Marquette Park, and this led them to take part. They were the group in the famous Skokie incident of the late 1970s. Which, by the way, if you see the Blues Brothers, when they run over the Illinois Nazis, is actually directly about the Skokie incident. Almost everything in there is verbatim, except them getting run over. David Duke started running for office and was elected Louisiana State Representative in 1989. He had been in the college student group of the, what was the American Nazi Party. Other groups continued to hold these like high-profile rallies that turned into brawls. One of them is documented in the Academy Award-nominated movie, The California Right. If you're interested in 70s neo-Nazism, watch that movie. And the funny thing is, a piece of The California Right is the speech, used as the speech verbatim in the Blues Brothers. So what I've also found out here is that a terrorist faction developed amongst these splinter groups. One of the former party members became a serial killer and tried to assassinate Hustler publisher Larry Flint. Fun fact, this happened in my hometown in a little town in Georgia, Lawrenceville. William Pierce had been a leader in the party. He wrote the hugely influential race-war novel, The Turner Diaries, which helped inspire the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. But it was James Mason who came up with the most extreme position of these. He decided there was no political route to power for neo-Nazis today. Therefore, they should abandon organizations and elections and marches altogether and try to disrupt not just the government, but to cause chaos in society itself through a campaign of random terrorism. It was only after that that National Socialists would have a chance to gain power. He developed these ideas in his newsletter Siege, which he self-published between 1980 and 1986. He had a habit of writing to prisoners, and through that he befriended Charles Manson and said he was the new neo-Nazi guru. And so, as I said, he praised random massacres, mass murderers, racial unrest, and serial killers, but he said to do them very publicly and in a very stylized fashion. And it's this claim that has become very influential today. We can see it in a series of copycat white supremacist massacres where the perpetrator issues a manifesto, livecast the attacks as they occur, and then they use guns painted with slogans. A whole series of them. Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand started this, where people use that format and continue them. So we can always see when one of these massacres happen, if they're part of this, if they start saying, and his manifesto was leaked and it was screamed online, we're like, all right, copycat. We don't have to wait for more evidence. What happened, his ideas were wildly unpopular, even amongst neo-Nazis, and he never made more than 100 copies of issue of his newsletter. But right before he folded up shop, he met some people who changed his life, and therefore faced modern terrorism. So these guys were all part of a small branch off of the punk rock scene. We called it the extreme culture. And it was a little more sophisticated. They were like publishers and writers and artists and musicians, but they fetishized extremes for their own sake. So they were into things like serial killers, pedophilia and child murder, cult leaders. They were all very into Charles Manson, Hitler, eugenics and dysgenics, and necrophilia. And this was all tied up with industrial music, which was a kind of a harsh one-chord atonal music. And so this is important because the industrial musician Boyd Rice was the first one to contact Mason. Now, I'm sure some people in there, I can see by the way he dressed, are familiar with Boyd Rice. And there have been accusations about him and his involvement with neo-Nazism for decades, and he has consistently denied these things. And I found, because as I said, I found these letters, he had written copious letters to Mason that these accusations were not just true, but far worse than anyone knew. Since Rice didn't live in Portland, and I don't want to go on too long, especially when I hear from Steve, I'm not going to go through this, but there is a chapter about him in my book, and I made a video about this called Boyd Rice, Neo-Nazi Collaborator. It's on YouTube if you want to see the highlights of all of his letters with swastikas and bragging about all the things he did and signing them with 8/8s to Mason. And in fact, there's chapters on several of these people, including Michael Moynihan and Adam Parker and Keith Steinle, who I'll talk about. But Rice is important for the story because in '86, as right before Mason folded up Siege, Rice was obsessed with Hitler and Charles Manson. He heard about James Mason. He started sending him fawning letters. And then he introduced a number of other people to him. So, and some of these other people lived in Portland later. The best known of this is Adam Parfrey, who at the time said he was living in, quote, Jew York, a term both him and Rice used. Parfrey is famous for founding the underground press Feral House. It became a very well-known press in countercultural circles, starting with the slacker conspiracy theory craze in the 1990s. Feral House has sold hundreds of thousands of books. Some of them have ended up being Hollywood films, and when Parfrey died in 2018, there was a sizable obit for him in the New York Times. Strangely, however, the Times did not mention his relationship to either James Mason or Siege, despite the fact that he's directly thanked in the book, and that the Times has written plenty about Adam Waffen and terrorism. Now, Parfrey got around a lot. I knew many people who knew him. He was the kind of guy who was everything to everyone, and that is to say he was a pathological liar. And this came in very handy to him as he denied his neo-Nazi connections throughout his life. When Parfrey first wrote Mason in 1986, he was running a New York art magazine called Exit, and he, in that magazine, became the first person to publish Mason outside of neo-Nazi circles. Parfrey was also the first person to put Mason in a book, the cult classic anthology Apocalypse Culture. This anthology has gone through 3 editions, sold tens of thousands of copies, and is still in print. And so, Feral House is still making money off of James Mason. In both it and other places, Parfrey published numerous other white supremacists and Holocaust deniers. He always dodged accusations of adherence by claiming he was into extremes for their own sake. As he was issuing these denials, Parfrey was at the same time writing incredibly racist and anti-Semitic letters to Mason. For example, he denounced, quote, race mixing and otherwise polluted people, and he called Michael Jackson, quote, a little monkey. But Parfrey didn't just publish Mason. Amongst other things, he agreed to make a racist collage for Mason. He bought publications and archives from him. He gave Mason advice on how to advertise his publications. And he agreed to publish a book by him on the American Nazi Party's George Lincoln Rockwell. Although the book didn't come out, I mean, basically Parfrey realized this was going to be a bridge too far for people, even though he was already tainted with this stuff. He wrote Mason at the time, and I'll read this passage. He says, if the book comes out, I'm counting on heavy censorship, condemnation, and subtle boycotts by Zog. Zionist occupied government, when it appears. So I'm trying to get together a book written by N-word and SPIC gang members on youth gangs for release at the same time. To me, letting these cocaine-addled N-word murderers prattle on about their miserable lives will be rope enough for them to hang themselves. And in that way, I can always point to the book when the ADL gets on my case about racism and neo-Nazis. In 1987, Parfrey met the violent white supremacist leader Tom Metzger and even published a piece in his newspaper, The White Aryan Resistance. And this kind of conduct from him continued on for years. Now, regardless of this, Parfrey's fawning sycophants defend him to this day, to their death, after his death, saying he was only interested in extremes, or he only said these things to gain access to these people. Now, I read probably thousands of pages of letters to Mason from all kinds of people, and Parfrey's was by far the most racist and anti-Semitic. So he did not need to do this to gain access to Mason. And he remained close to white supremacists to the very end of his life, and even in the last few years became very open about being on their platforms and his connection to them. So Parfrey lived in Portland for a few times. For the first time was a few months in end of 87 through early 88. In the spring of 1992, Parfrey came to town to speak at Powell's to promote a misogynistic book he had just published, what we readily identified as part of the manosphere today. It was met by feminist protests, and the local media defended Parfrey, praising him as a brave free speech fighter against the mean totalitarian feminist censors. There's just some wild articles. I was talking with Steve of this from the time. If you go back and read PDXS and the Willamette Week and other stuff, I mean, it's just off the chain to read these things now. By really mainstream things. Parfrey moved back here in 92 or early 93, and he stayed for a number of years, and this means he was living here when the book Siege came out. He is thanked in the book. He was the first person to call James Mason and congratulate him on it, and he even openly offered to help with the publicity for the book. And in 2003, long after he had stopped publishing Mason, Parfrey offered to help out with Siege's second edition. Now, you will find this kind of information about him in the obituaries written by white supremacists, but you will not find it in the New York Times obituary, nor in the Willamette Weeks, despite their copious coverage of him over the years. So if you knew Parfrey at this time, while you were talking to him, while the Willie Week was promoting him, he was encouraging Mason, and Mason was encouraging his readers to commit racist and anti-Semitic murders. The second important figure here that's typed Portland is Michael Moynihan. He was an industrial musician and then founded a neo-folk band called Blood Axes. He met Rice in 1988, and then Rice introduced him to Mason. The two hit it off, and the next year Moynihan agreed to edit Mason's newsletters into a book. It took him 4 years to finish this, which honestly I now can appreciate since it took me 5 to write this book. And Moynihan published Siege himself in early 1993. In his introduction to the book, Moynihan advocated that people should put Mason's ideas into real-world action, and he appeared in public representing Mason's neo-Nazi paper organization, the Universal Order. Now, it's true that Moynihan is less hidden about his politics than the others, because he's an open, decentralized ethno-separatist, but he's denied ever having been a National Socialist. But if you look at his letters and actions, it's clear that in the early and mid-1990s, he was an acolyte of Mason's. For example, despite later saying he wasn't a Holocaust denier, right after Siege came out, he said, "The 6 million number is just arbitrary and inaccurate, and probably a gross exaggeration. I have read revisionist books which make a good case against much of the Holocaust canon." And so Parfrey had published Siege. That means he was still selling copies when he moved here in 1995, and he came here to work for Parfrey's Feral House Press. He went to Portland State, finished up his undergraduate degree there, and then wrote a famous book called Lords of Chaos. I can see people who know this by their patches. No names, no names. It was the first accessible overview of the notorious Norwegian black metal scene, most famous for Burzum, and that scene itself was involved in murder and neo-Nazism. Parfrey published this book in 1998, and it too sold tens of thousands of copies and was more recently made into a pretty bad movie. Like Parfrey, Moynihan functioned openly in the city. For example, he did a reading at a popular fanzine shop about a 5-minute walk from here. After his book came out, though, people started calling him out and protesting his ban because they knew about Siege. But he didn't want to ruin his popularity, and so Moynihan started a campaign of denials and got many publications to repeat his lies. Now, I read lots of these, and the absolute worst one was a cover article in the Willamette Week in 2000, and in my opinion, it was an intentional attempt to whitewash him by a guy who was basically acting as he wanted to whitewash Moynihan's role as an advocate of neo-Nazi terrorism. Go ahead.
You sure told me at the time.
That he was doing that? Oh my God, these guys, a bunch of pathological liars and sociopaths lied to you, Steve?
We'll get back to that.
Nazis are liars? Shit, they don't just ruin everything, they're not truthful. This is why I like James Mason, who's like, yeah, I'm a Nazi, absolutely. Finally, someone who's just open about it. The article is by Zach Dundas, and it's called Lord of Chaos, Activists Accuse Portland writer and musician Michael Moynihan of spreading extremist propaganda. But they're not telling the whole story. And I kind of agree with it. The story's actually worse than people were telling. There's actually a lot more stuff. And in it, he attacks people like Steve, who was working at the time with the Coalition for Human Dignity. Dundas claimed Moynihan had been slandered, calling the largely accurate claims against him a jihad. It's actually a little funny because he was pro-Islamist. So. Dundas admits Moynihan distributed Siege, but does not say he was either its editor or its publisher. Dundas used tactics like dismissing direct statements from Moynihan on the basis that they appeared, quote, in old fanzines and outfield websites, and they are thus built on quicksand. But what he didn't do is say that any of these quotes were wrong. And the best part of the article, my absolute favorite, is he says that people were criticizing Moynihan for following a Santrue Northern European form of paganism, and that the critics failed to clarify that there were both racist and anti-racist forms of this religious belief. Now, what Dundas doesn't do is specify that Moynihan belonged to the racist faction. So the article's sidebar then helpfully tells you which record stores in town you can go buy Blood Access with. I'm going to also briefly mention this, but he recruited Portland musicians, and he played with a guy named Marcus Wolf, who I was a little shocked. He was a founder of the legendary underground band Crash Worship, who played the most amazing show I've ever seen and seen hundreds of shows, although Wolf was no longer in the band. And ended up recently living at a friend's house. So there's a longer story about Wolf. People are interested in talk about it later. So now these guys, Boyd Rice, Adam Parfrey, Michael Moynihan, they worked with another guy, a Satanist named Nicholas Schreck, who was married to Anton LaVey's daughter. They ended up recruiting like a circle of other people around them. This was several dozen people, and I have a nifty little chart of concentric circles in the book if you want to see who they are. The best known locally was Jim Goad, who has more recently given up the ghost and admitted to being a white supremacist, as well as the younger Marilyn Manson, who was a protege of Boyd Rice. This guy, Keith Steinle, was part of the circle, but unlike the others, he was a well-known Holocaust denier. He worked for several years at the Institute for Historical Review, which was the main organization that spread Holocaust denial in the United States. He spent 2 years as the editor of its pseudo-academic Journal of Historical Review. He wrote scholarly works like $50,000 Auschwitz Reward Unclaimed, Gas Chambers Myth Continues to Crumble, and he was quoted in a lot of mainstream newspapers. And this is all to say, Steinle was not in hiding about who he was. So he moved here in the late 80s and he did graduate work at Portland State. He knew the others I mentioned, Boyd Rice and Michael Moynihan, but he was closest to Adam Parfrey. They were both living here. And in 1991, Steinle announced that he had become Parfrey's publicist. So Parfrey would publish Holocaust deniers like very openly, but he would not publish Holocaust denial itself. So we had no qualms about working. And people like Steinle were so openly tolerated in the city, he actually wrote a cover story for the Willamette Week in 1991. It was a profile of a local Satanist, Diabolus Rex, who had connections to these same people. Rex is amiable enough. I actually gave a talk about Nazi Satanism a couple months ago at this occult bookstore on East Burnside, Dark Star Magic, and he showed up and he was like, "Oh, I'd like to talk, coffee later." So, didn't say if he changed his views or what his views were, but So Steinle died in 1992. It's a very strange story. He was a gay man, and he died of AIDS-related illness. And I didn't get into this here about Adam Parfrey is Jewish. Like, there's a lot of very weird stuff about these people who are working directly with neo-Nazis. Also, the guy who was the center figure in the Skokie incident was Jewish, and his dad had been in a camp. And this isn't so uncommon. Anyway, as another, so Steinle's papers are actually at the University of Oregon in Eugene. I was just there the other week rifling through them. And an interesting side note to Jewish studies scholars here, Linda Meisels, writes about Jewish issues in books, did her master's at PSU on Steinle, the same place he went to school. Do we still have time? We have time to go on, people? All right. So one of the more depressing things I found out. Yeah, the other things were just light. It was about a couple that I knew here in the 1990s. I lived here in the late 90s. And these were situationist anarchists who ran a mail-order bookshop called Extreme Books. The Schultzes. And they sold Siege, despite saying they disagreed with its actual politics and only liked the whole apocalyptic revolutionary schema. The dude involved wrote for PDXS, a weekly newspaper founded by Jim Redden. And Redden had been a Willamette Week writer and then founded this weekly paper, was sort of a competitor to the Willamette Week, and then later worked for the Portland Tribune, and he just retired. So Redden published many of these people as well. It's really disturbing because he covered the Tom Metzger trial for the Willamette Week in 1990, and then 2 years later published the Holocaust denier Keith Steinle. In 1993, he wrote a long piece about Charles Manson, and about a third of it is about James Mason. In 1994, PDXS published the aforementioned anarchist in an article about a Seattle art show that was curated by Parfrey. At it, Moynihan staffed a booth where he exhibited James Mason's propaganda. And Mason says the only reason he wasn't there is he had been arrested and he was like on house arrest. So Mason got interviewed for this PDXS article, and there he was called, quote, smart, articulate, well-read, funny, and personable. And Siege was described as, quote, one of the better written and more interesting books on political theory I have read in a long time. So this is the kind of stuff you could read in the alternative papers in Portland in the 90s. And then later that year, Redden co-authored an article with Parfrey for the Village Voice. So now we'll get to Tom Metzger and the White Aryan Resistance. As I said, one of the most famous violent white supremacist leaders in the 80s and 90s. Now Metzger didn't live in Portland, but I'm sure people know, but I'll go over his infamous here in 1988. A few blocks from Laurelhurst Park, some of his minions killed the Ethiopian immigrant Mulugeta Sarah. Yesterday was the 36th anniversary of his murder. And very strange, I took a lift here and I was talking to the cab driver. He was like, oh, I'm Ethiopian. And I was like, what are you doing? I was telling him, and he was like, oh yeah, I was working at the club that night that Sarah and his friends were at, and I still see them around town. So Metzger was later successfully sued by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the trial was held here in Portland. That's what Redden was covering. Metzger was James Mason's main supporter in the 80s and 90s. Metzger put him on the cover of his newspaper to promote Siege when it came out, and sold hundreds of copies of the book through his own mail order service. And I found this crazy video. There was this talk show, the McLaughlin Report, and Metzger's on it, and it's one episode, he holds up a copy of Siege on national TV, and he's like, this is where it's at, you should read this. And then Metzger too was connected to all these people. Boyd Rice had been a guest on his cable access TV show, and as I said, he published out of Parfrey in his paper. Last, I'm going to briefly mention Bob Hike. Hike was the leader of the first national Nazi skinhead gang, the American Front, and he also moved here in 1990. Hike was close friends with all these guys. He was in a formal alliance with Metzger. He was close to Rice and Moynihan. He was a big fan of Mason, and he wrote to him. And Steinle was writing an article about him for PDXS when he died. So, just to summarize, at the exact time that neo-Nazis like James Mason and Tom Metzger were encouraging their followers to murder Jews, people of color, LGBTQ plus people and others, their confidants, collaborators, and publishers were living here in Portland, Oregon in the 80s and 90s. They functioned openly in the city's cultural milieu, and they did this largely uncontested. And this is a lot of people like this to be living in one city at one time. Well, you can say, what were you doing?
Well, let me
let me start by saying that I encourage you all to buy this book. As one of the folks who has been involved with this, you keep talking about late 80s, early 90s. When I moved to town, when Judy and I moved to town in the late 80s, we were shocked. I'm sorry, speaking of Mike, but we were really shocked to find this scene thriving, and I got sucked into it as an activist. I want to acknowledge, say a few words about the local scene, which is central to the book, and this is the definitive book both about siege culture and tells us a lot about the history of Portland. It's a scary story. There's a lot of scary stuff in here. It's particularly relevant to the political events of the last couple of weeks. I'll come back to that, but let me quickly acknowledge the presence, I don't want to embarrass her, of Eleanor Langer, who wrote one of the most important books about this moment, 100 Little Hitlers, which is a marvelous book about the Milligan Serra's murder and the trial of Metzger. I encourage you all to have a look at it. It was through Ellie, I think it was through Ellie Langer that I got involved with the Coalition for Human Dignity at that time, along with a number of others, some of whom were activists, some of whom had other kinds of backgrounds. And one of our focuses was Holocaust denial, because among other things, the folks who Spencer has been describing were importing international Holocaust denial to Portland. And one of the many mysteries at the time for those of us who were resisting working on this, as we were monitoring this phenomenon, is how connected it was, in fact, internationally. David Irving, the most important at that time, and perhaps still today, he has been the best known Holocaust denier of the world, and came here to little old Portland in the 90s several times and caused a lot of upheaval for us. It took a long time for us to get to understand who these folks were who were bringing him here, why he was so interested in coming here. But of course, half dozen of the other figures, this is a voluminous book, and again, I urge you all to have a look at it, but it has a lot to do with the scene of Portland. Portland has a lot to do with the scene described in this book, which is to say, international neo-Nazi terrorism. That's the flip side of Portland, but it's important for us to understand the history here, which has been ugly. A couple things that, since you mentioned the Willamette Week article, and when Willamette Week did the cover story on Michael Moynihan, our coalition got wind of this, and I met with the guy who wrote the article. You mentioned this, and I'm still sure. I wrote you an email, I think, yesterday or today saying I'm still pissed off about this but it taught me a lot about what has happened over the subsequent years. I had no idea. So we had been doing months and months of research about this guy, Moynihan, and being, as an academic, I was a kind of tenacious researcher, and I had lots and lots of evidence about him. I met with the author of this article for the Willamette Week, gave him all this material, and just blew it off, and wrote this kind of puff piece about Moynihan. Moynihan has then gone on to become one of the key mainstreamers of international neo-fascism, neo-Nazism, through the promotion of a figure named Julius Evola, who was the most important neo-Nazi of the post-war period. And this guy Moynihan, who was here at the time on the scene at the time, has continued to churn out translations of all of Averlich's books, which are read around the world. There is probably no more important neo-fascist figure in the world and more influential than Averlich, and Moynihan has been his kind of point guy, including doing Audible. You're all familiar with Audible, the spoken books company. So Moynihan has in fact narrated Averlich's books for Audible, so you can get those if you want. It would be nice to lean on them, to get them to take them off the list.
I'm going to add something. What happens is his books are on, and the Audible books are Aaron Traditions, which is distributed by Simon & Schuster. So you can buy these things through Simon & Schuster on their website.
So I think this is an interface between our interests, and that is the way in which mainstream media and other mainstream institutions have, in effect, helped these figures. And this book is an important documentation of that assertion. It's not a stretch anymore to say that we saw one of the consequences of this institutional mainstream support of these extremist and violent figures in the election. Just one thing, and then we can open it up. I think when we dealt with the Holocaust deniers, or the figures that Spencer has been describing firsthand, they always, in a surprisingly sophisticated denials, denied what they were doing while they were doing it. And this was a kind of stance which was kind of peculiar to me at the time and fascinated me as an academic. Now we all know what gaslighting is. Now we all know what trolling is. And now we know what the political consequences are. But at the time, I didn't really know what these guys, what the Harfrey who Spencer has been describing was in some ways the ultimate troll. Because everything was kind of done in a way that was very splashy and bold. And then if you'd asked him, he denied that it actually had just all the violent and horrific valences that it obviously had. So that there were that plausible kind of thinly plausible deniability, that kind of stance ended up being very influential on many other far-right groups. And we've seen the consequences in the past few weeks. I'll stop and we can talk about this. I think that we were helped here in Portland, and we didn't know one of the strange things we moved here at the end of '86, and many of the figures between the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s, all these figures came to town. And not only did Irving repeatedly come, but all the figures many of them you were describing, both the real hardcore fascist stuff as well as these intellectuals and the artistic ones, all came here, which also was a reason I felt like I had no choice to get into it, partly just to understand what these people were doing here and what kind of city had I moved to. Many of the cultural artifacts from the time you may be familiar with, and I'll just mention one, and that is Fight Club, which spun out of the scene and has a surprisingly direct connection to it. Enough of that. I'm curious to know how you might think some of what your research can tell us about the election. That's a lot.
I want to hear from you about the Oregonian.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you about the Oregonian. So we were chatting about this because the William Week, as we just said, were in accessories, and so was the Oregonian. When David Irving, the world's most famous Holocaust denier, who came here repeatedly And we had this little, anti-hate group that were monitoring all this, so we kept trying to publicize it and deal with it and resist it, but almost to no avail. Some of you may remember the name of Phil Stanford, who was a longtime columnist at the Oregonian and other publications in town. And so when we reached out to the Oregonian, when Irving was coming to town, I had the same experience, and again, because I was the egghead from Reed College, I was like the point guy to go to talk with him because I had this evidence, and he writes a column saying, some of these people are saying that this Irving is a Holocaust veteran, but he's not. He's just a historical revisionist. This is the paper of record, and again, this is kind of great. So they succeeded in convincing. You mentioned Redden and Stanford, and so it made the level at which they were able successfully to legitimize what they. And also to lie about it on a scale which is so bold and audacious, it's still kind of breathtaking. When you again, I'm going to say once again, you should get Spencer's book because it's terrifying when you realize what the trajectory really was, which were the guys who were setting out the template for international terroristic massacres. And there was a template. And so when you think about the Oregonian and the Willamette Week and all these other institutions, they just didn't get it. And it's been a struggle all these years to try and get the mainstream media to understand what the threat is, but I'm afraid it's too late.
Yes, it is too late for intellectuals to help the situation. I mean, I think that's clear to every 2016. God, I think about 2016 when Trump was first coming in, and we were like, oh no, there's too much work to do. There are too many things to write about. There's too many things to tell people. And now I'm like, geez, I don't know what the fuck to tell people. Well, we can document more Nazis, but I guess we can drive them out of certain jobs or something. But there's just going to be more. Like, I just don't really know what to do. They definitely, some of the influence, there's a couple different influences. One is Mason's direct influence, that he is inspiring this international, like, underground of neo-Nazi accelerationist terrorists. And I mean, it's really kind of breathtaking how big it is. I mean, it's in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, Eastern and Western Europe. There was even an attack in Turkey a few months ago that was directly inspired by this. This guy was like a terrorgram guy. People are using his ideas people are reading his stuff and then carrying them out. It's meant in Jacksonville, Florida. There was a massacre a couple of years ago at a dollar store, and the guy mentioned siege in his manifesto. So there's this, and Mason meets with people. There's all these, the guy who killed Samuel Woodward, who killed Blaise Bernstein, the young gay man in California. There's a picture of him at Mason's apartment meeting with him. So there's this. And then there's these guys. I don't really quite, people said this to me, and I hadn't thought of it. That kind of conduct they're engaged in had not happened before in the fascist milieu, I don't think. I can't think of any precursors. One guy called it winky wink fascism. You saw Andrew Anglin maybe very much like this. They acted like Nazis in public, then they said they weren't Nazis, but they were Nazis. And this, it was all over the fingerprints of the alt-right, this sort of plausible deniability and a playfulness in it. If you ever read, it's excellent, it's a tiny little book, it's really an essay by Jean-Paul Sartre called Anti-Semite and Jew. It's excellent. He describes this oily nature of the anti-Semite. Like, they know, he describes them as being playful. He's like, they know what they're saying isn't true. And if you
because they're amusing themselves.
They're amusing, that's right.
Yeah.
He's like, and if you corner them, they'll eventually admit that, yeah, maybe you're right, this isn't exactly true. And then they'll go back to it. Like, the point is not honesty. It's so funny with Nazis, they always talk about honor and things. So you're the most dishonorable people possible. I mean, it's even in National Socialist ideology that the ends justify the means, right? They're like, it doesn't matter what you do or how you get there. So there's this sort of playfulness, and this stuff is, I do not claim that the alt-right directly takes it from them, although it certainly must in some way. I can't show the exact carrier group. Some of these people did influence it, like Jim Goad. They were all working with Goad. And Gavin McGinnis, who founded the Proud Boys, says that Goad was his favorite writer and biggest influence. And so, but definitely the way they're acting became the way that the whole alt-right has acted, and then people know this intuitively. I know Hannah Gaze at SPLC is writing a book on this. Basically, the alt-right in 2014, 16, 18, it's largely kind of faded away. I mean, there's like Fuentes over here and Patriot Front over here, but the way that they act, the way that they bring their message across, the sort of taunting, loose association with facts, like knowing that they're throwing lies out there. This has become the Republican Party. Like, they don't need to be anywhere. They don't need to exist as a movement anywhere. Their ideas are now the ruling party in the United States. And I think in a way this has been the big influence of this group of people. And of course, again, back on the outright terrorism side, like accelerationism has now spread much further than just neo-Nazi currents. There's all kinds of people on the far right who embrace this philosophy, but they are being driven. The hardest form of the militant wing, the most militant of the militant wings are these neo-Nazis, but their ideas are in somewhat watered down forms, spreading amongst further parts of the far right.
So even a figure like Stephen Bannon, who I've not yet heard is formally returned to the White House, but I assume is going to, espouses yet a kind of a fancy version of this accelerationism, which is basically burn it all down. They want to accelerate the apocalypse. He's an extreme Catholic, but a lot of them use this term Kali Yuga, with this bogus Hindu term to refer to this apocalypse. It's where Parfrey gets this apocalypse culture. So, but it's very much about burning it all down. That's why Moynihan wrote a book which glorified, again at the time I couldn't believe this, that glorifies the burning of medieval Norwegian churches on the basis, of course, of this ideology. Burn it all down. Maybe we should open up for questions.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. People wanna ask things again.
I can come around with the microphone too.
All right.
Doesn't want to project. She's dead, right? Is this on? Should be. Blue. Oh, womp womp. It's on. It's just not very loud. I'm loud enough. Yeah, I just wanted to offer a suggestion in a hopeful vein. If people haven't listened to the It Did Happen Here podcast and read the book, get that book. It's from PM Press. People were organizing against these people, boneheads, not skinheads. You know about it. We have mutual friends. Yeah, right. So everyone should think about and familiarize themselves with ways that, you know, these people were pushed back. Unfortunately, they are like whack-a-mole. We have to keep whacking. It's like stamping out cockroaches. But we did it then, and unfortunately, we have to keep doing it.
Thank you. I will just say, it's been, for somebody of my vintage, it is pretty discouraging at this point. When the Proud Boys started to come to town to mess up this town big time, it was very hard to convince all my bourgeois friends to get out into the streets and push back against these guys, and now it's too late.
They didn't listen to us. I've been yelling the same thing since 1993.
Remember when Ted Wheeler went to the Rose Parade and like defended them from being on free speech basis? Wasn't he there with there's so many murders, right? Just because I had the Max murderer was there. Like, and I mean, I blame Wheeler for opening the door to all these protests here in Portland. Instead of saying we will not allow these things to go on and we will mobilize civil society. You don't need to like invoke law enforcement, but we're going to mobilize civil society against this rather than saying yes, you should do this.
Good evening. I read that in all of the developed countries, the move has been to the right, to throw out the incumbents and to move toward the right. How do we fit into that? I mean, are we exempt and different, or are we all similar, or is this movement so broad at this point in time that they have that great influence? That's the first question. Second question is, to what degree does free speech play into helping the American Nazi Party?
I'll take it first. So an interesting thing about Trump is that the wave of xenophobic right-wing populism that we see, like America, as the United States, is kind of a bit of a latecomer to it, and part of this is a product of the two-party system. The first of these major xenophobic parties that did well in the elections was in 1998, 1999 in Austria in the Freedom Party. And each year it grew more and more in all these different countries in Europe. It's not all the countries. Poland has turned a little left, shockingly. I was in Norway, I gave a talk in Oslo, which Didrik Soderlund, who was Michael Moynihan's co-author, showed up to. Total scumbag. In Norway, it was like the 90s again. They were like, oh yeah, we know this stuff is happening, but it's not happening here. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. But it was crazy because it's happening everywhere else. In Europe, Eastern Europe is always, Russia has always had this super strong strain of nationalism. It is in some other countries. It's not necessarily in other countries around the world. But obviously the US has strong political, social, and cultural connections with Europe. And it's worse here because it's a winner-take-all system. So like in Germany, they're like, AfD is the xenophobic populist, right-wing populist party there. People are like, the AfD is doing better in each election and starting to almost win in provinces. I'm like, yeah, well, wait till you're in the States and there's like, you get one or the other, and it's like the AfD is in power in the States. So some of this is the two-party system and just the ability internally in the Republican Party for the right-wing populists to champion over the neoliberals. So I don't know, it is part of a bigger thing. I think some of this on the really big level is, I get so much in the weeds doing this stuff. It's not like when I used to do a lot of like theoretical work in prior life, right? Before like Trump just absorbed everything. I think liberal democracy has reached, I don't say it's burned out, but it has reached the limit of its expansion, in which people look to it that life was getting better, or there were other opportunities, or it could provide new things. It no longer inspires people. I mean, I think we see this in the election. Like, Harris just didn't inspire people. The number of voters who turned out for her was low. It didn't even inspire her base. And I think that, like, other things like Islamist politics aren't going to ever have mass appeal in the Western countries. But right-wing populism can, and it is the alternative to, I think, the exhaustion with the liberal philosophy, and the left, obviously, like the left to the left of liberalism, social democracy, anarchists, Marxist Leninism is not appealing to people either. There aren't new big movements like that, and so I think some of this is it is not the necessary. It is not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily need to be a rightward turn, but it will be something else as an alternative to liberalism. And it is taking that space because nothing else is. That's my high-level thoughts on those things. Do you want to do the free speech, or?
Well, to follow up on that, speech is not speech anymore, right? We think of Stephen Douglas in the debating with Lincoln. Human beings standing up with the human voice in here, a human audience, that's long gone. And if there's one factor I could point to that helps us understand the phenomena we're talking about, it's very broadly media. But media is not what you might think of, newspapers and television. It's a whole, today, of course, obviously a whole universe of interconnected, overwhelmingly powerful and amplifying phenomenon. It is not, I think we'll see in retrospect that it's no surprise that the so-called richest man in the world and one of these handful of tech lords who own the country now is also entering the White House. So it's the tech world of media is a world that has left books and learning its way. Those of us in higher education, like we're all being left in the dust. That along with traditional speech, traditional politics, all the old ways of doing things have all been wiped away, among other things, by the globalization of these media forces, and particularly the continuing power of them to overwhelm us with computing power. And that it makes, for just one last word about this, at the rather poignant end of the Harris campaign, she was giving these very passionate speeches about policies. And I did think to myself, who the hell cares about policies, right? Because people are not any longer sitting down, when ideologies used to reign, you would get a pamphlet, or you would get, you would go to a speaker and there would be an ideology and you would follow it, you would adhere to it, and you would be convinced by it. That's all gone. So people are absorbing what we're talking about, so-called politics, in a completely different way. Social media is clearly one of those directions, but it's all pervasive. It's coming from, and it's happening, of course, faster and faster as well. So we think we're surprised by a lot of these phenomena, but they are, just to end this point, they're certainly not restricted in any place in the world, because they're everywhere now, because the whole technological universe is everywhere.
Just a quick one. You both have shown some puzzlement regarding this movement over the decades happening in Portland. Why Portland? I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought, but why little old Portland can be a place that just to phone
Well, there's a number of Portlanders here. I'm sure you all have some thoughts about this. It's a complicated question, and I have to say that I've given a number of panels and discussions here in this room over the years about this. Portland has two faces. It's actually, a lot of it has changed now, but for a while it was pretty clear it had this kind of double personality. It was the kind of the bastion of liberalism, Portlandia, etc. On the one hand, so we became known as Keep Portland Weird, and that whole side of our beloved city on the one hand. Meanwhile, the characters we're talking about were coming here, were migrating here to create an Aryan nation. And a lot of the original activist phenomena among these folks was also based here. So that's about the Pacific Northwest, not just Portland, but Portland became, along with Seattle, one of the centers for all this. And there were reasons why they came here. Among others, there was this it was partly because it was a very white. And there's a long history of the KKK and the ex-Confederates coming here. There's a whole series. I recommend the work of, some of you may know Seth Kotler, who works in our area and is doing some very important work on the far-right Republican Party here that also helped us understand the kind of activism that was based here.
I want to talk about this, as the slogan goes, keep Portland with sugar. But that boat has sailed, unfortunately, I think. Why Portland? I'm going to look at a micro scale, because I did live here for a few years at the late 90s. I was deeply involved in this scene with these people. I'd say I've seen Boyd Rice play, and I own Feral House books, and have numerous mutual friends with Adam Harfrey and such, or acquaintances. I'm trying to keep people as friends through working in publishing. But Portland was a big center for the counterculture at that time, like a huge center. When I moved here, I lived in different places. I was like, wow, this whole city is so countercultural. And this city is not very, certainly at the time more than now, there was very much a live and let live, and like a refusal to like confront people. And not a very intellectual climate here. I have a really hard time. Not a very intellectual climate, even amongst the activist left, where people read books. They don't really they're not critically engaged. I mean, I lived in New York for a couple decades, and I'm used to people just going to talks and going at it, really well-educated people, lots of grad students and professors or whatever people with PhDs as part of an activist scene, very common in Europe too, and that's not what it is here. So there is a acceptance of things here, and because by the late 80s there had been this 90s, this big scene that was blending and absorbing all of these other elements that were happening all over. And I think part of it was so big here, it is so white here, there is this history of the far right here, and there is this live and let live attitude, and I think that really helped propel it here. That is certainly from my micro, this is like from me having participated in it. I think at some level there's just such a big countercultural scene of this kind, a lot of weirdo countercultural scene. Like this wasn't the punk scene proper or something, or even the skinhead scene. There's a lot of weirdos in Portland, and this was a weirdo scene. And so there was just a big scene of this here as part of it, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, the among other things, for those of you old enough to remember, the beat phenomenon, the so-called beatniks from the 50s, were partly centered in Portland, specifically at Reed College, where a number of the most important beat writers went to school. And Gary Snyder, who was one of the most distinguished of these writers who went to Reed, remains, he's still alive, a very influential anarchist. So he became a Buddhist, but so that anarchism was very deep also in the roots of Portland weirdness.
Thank you both for your contributions tonight. You talked at several points about accelerationism and its connection with fascist dreams and formations, and I'm curious if you have thoughts about left-wing accelerationism, because it strikes me that there is a kind of accelerationist organizing that happens on the left, but I think accelerationism inevitably will lead to fascism, and so I'm just curious if like an anti-fascist, if we're going to get serious about anti-fascism in Portland going forward after this election, if we have to not only think about resisting like the obvious fascists, but also people who are doing things that are ultimately destabilizing and destructive that are just going to like actually support the formation of fascist power.
I'm sorry, could you give direct examples on the left of this?
I mean, I don't like, I'm going out on a limb here because I don't have any evidence to, a lot of folks, of course, were in black bloc clothing and not like, not leaving treatises behind, but a lot of the property destruction that happened in 2020 that then got used to just totally undermine the 95 or 98% of the activism in 2020 that was all for Black Lives Matter, it was all about resisting the right-wingers that were showing up. All of that got repositioned nationally as crazy leftists wanted to burn the city down, right? And I don't
You're quoting the new president.
Right.
He put a target on our back and demonized so-called Antifa.
Totally. And I don't think it was the Proud Boys or whoever smashing all the windows in downtown Portland. I don't think it was. I don't think it was the right-wingers that came and did that. I'm suspicious that was coming from a
Do you want to trade a few broken windows for democracy? Because that's what happened.
Right.
That's fine. Right, there's a bunch of different things here that let's separate. First off, when we're talking about actual accelerationism, attempting intentionally to disrupt social and political stability through random terrorism that's not happening on the left. It is, in a way, it's part of a larger idea that things have to get worse before they get better. Like, it's a form of that. And then all radical currents, probably across the world, everyone can hold to that. It's like something you can, cling to when you've been defeated, right? It's like a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So you hear that every election from leftists. Oh, that's great. Trump, Reagan, Bush, they'll create the revolution. No. There really are nobody on the left that advocates. I mean, Steve was the guy who was into Siege, who seriously advocate this kind of random terrorism to destroy the system. Maybe you could say they're lumped in the left, but they're not. ITS, what is the? I can't remember. This like eco-nihilist group, individuals tending towards the wild, I think is what it stands for. Yeah, but they're not actually leftists. I mean, this is a defined division, maybe, but actually quite big division. So I'm not thinking it's leftists. There aren't leftists saying these things. I mean, you're talking about black box stuff. There's always, I don't agree with you. I wasn't here. I certainly wasn't locked up. And if you were, you probably didn't know who everyone else was either. How would you do that? I don't have, there's no evidence. It's always said that black box are crypto far-right things or they're being manipulated or whatever. I don't believe that. This is a typical thing in Portland. It happens in all cities. It's a super liberal city with a mass protest culture. I think people forget this or don't see it. Portland is just such an inward-looking bubble, and I think this is really the problem here. The left here is very focused on mass protests. Whereas other cities, it's more based on long-term projects and has a more international, even national look. People really, in all levels, look inward here. I did a lot of work in the rural areas with the Rural Organizing Project. I did a report on the militias in 2016 called Up in Arms, Dietary Organized Militia Movement. And the main complaint of ROP and other progressives in the rest of the state is like, we don't get any help from Portland. Like, you guys just don't, you don't see yourself as part of it. And this is why the right wing, partly, for a lot of reasons, why they're so against Portland, but also why leftists can't win, because there's no, it's just Portland over there. So, because there is an effect, and I do agree that the militancy of these demonstrations ended up being, however it played out in Portland, it ended up being used by Trump to help impel their politics. And people in Portland just couldn't see what the results of their actions were outside of the city. And that is clearly, Trump was able to turn it into a caricature. He was, the conspiracy theories he used were anti-Semitic conspiracy theories with Antifa replacing the Jews. There were many articles about this at the time. And I hate to say this, but people did hand it to him to do that. He could have done that anyway, could have found something else anyway. I don't agree this is a form of accelerationism. I don't agree this is some kind of infiltration by right-wingers, but I do wish people in Portland would have a bigger view about the microscope that is put on here and how things look to others and how people relate to other parts of the country. This is just totally aside, and for activists, I didn't feel like I wasn't living here, so it wasn't my place to say things, but it did drive me crazy that people in Portland during these demonstrations never put out big public calls for help during the demonstrations for people who come from the rest of the country. And in fact, I've never heard of that happening in Portland. And if 10,000 people would have come, they couldn't stop Proud Boys from marching in the streets because the streets just would have been clogged. This is what happened at Charlottesville. That the organizers there did not get other people from the rest of the country. The people who put the calls out were people on Antifa networks. It wasn't the Charlottesville organizers. I'm still angry at that. I still have my emails from that.
Obviously,
there's them yelling at them.
There's no doubt a lot of anger in the room. The Proud Boys, again, just like some of these folks from an earlier generation, came here, of all places, to mess us up for a number of reasons which we're beginning to understand. But among other things, it was we now know, a dry run for the insurrection. A lot of the same folks who were on the streets here, I have pictures because I went to those events, ended up, these are folks who were busted on, what was it, January 6th. And when I went back and looked at these pictures, and some of them were including the leaders of the Proud Boys and the 3%ers, they were all coming repeatedly here, just as in an earlier generation, the characters that Spencer is studying here were coming here. I think there's a number of reasons for it, but it is a little unnerving, partly because the president has a long memory and is about to start a revenge tour. And I know from recent tweets, whatever he calls them now, that he hasn't forgotten us.
I don't know what the answer to these militant far-right street forces appearing here is. I just don't. I'm not gonna. But I do agree that they cut their teeth on the street battles here, and that made them feel like they could do it. They could storm the Capitol. And the other, I'm just really afraid what's going to happen when Trump pardons all the 1-6 people. Yeah. And then they're going to feel, some of them, okay, knowing a lot of people who got out of jail, some of them are going to be like, okay, I don't want to go to jail again. That was hard. But the rest of them are going to be like, yeah, now we can do whatever we want to. And I don't know what the answer to that's going to be if they hold a 500-person, demonstration in downtown Portland. I'm not sure what it's going to be. I do know if there's a huge street clash, like how Trump is going to cast this to people. But I don't know what those answers are. I've been an activist long enough to know that I usually don't know what the answers are.
Time for a few more questions.
In terms of translating some of this history into like the present day, I'm wondering, like if y'all have an overview of current fascist organizing locally, whether that's Portland or Vancouver, around here, or how much today it is about tracking local organizers versus just understanding that things are online, and like you're saying, people come here from elsewhere.
I think there's other people in the crowd who can answer that better than Steve or I. I mean, my impression just in general is most of the organizing is around the edges. It's not in town. It's in Vancouver and the suburbs and stuff. And people in town are being very, if they live in town, are being very quiet. But we will, and I think during these demonstrations, right, under Trump, it was largely people from out of town. They were traveling from out of state. Counter-protesters weren't necessary. So sorry I can't answer your question, maybe.
I can tell you that we just went to the Skeens in East Oregon, and as soon as you leave the Willamette Valley, you see lots, this was right before the election, lots and lots of Trump signs, no Harris signs. We stayed at a very small hotel in Diamond out in the Skeens, and these folks were enlightened, the folks who ran this place, but they said they would not put Harris signs up. It was too dangerous.
Hi, I'm wondering, do these ideas you're talking about sound a lot like the stuff we're seeing in Silicon Valley, like Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin? And I'm wondering if some of these like local figures have connections to them, especially since now we have their man in the vice presidency.
I think, thank you. Maybe you should tell everybody who might not know who Yarvin is.
Yeah. He's a blogger or internet personality who went by the name of Meches Mulba and has basically these same ideas about great replacement theory and just extreme like far-right fascist ideas, and he's extremely influential.
And hardwired surveillance.
Yeah.
On a specific level, they're kind of the neo-reactionary style of the movement Yarvin's part of accelerationism comes from a different place than the neo-Nazi siege culture style of accelerationism. I haven't found, I get asked this question sometimes. So again, on a micro level, explicit organizing level, for example, there's not a lot of influence. I think some of these guys sometimes do read. They're like, all right, well, there's this other accelerationism, let's check it out. But it's more like parallel kind of things. I mean, the thing is with accelerationism, then their guy's in the White House. Musk is in the White House. Why burn it all down? You got it. I mean, they may keep saying they need to burn it down while it's like saying, we unite to fight the power, and you're like, you are in power. What are you talking about? It's always projection.
Okay, do we have a question over here? Okay, back to the front.
I was wondering how many copies of Seed were sold, and do you have any idea of how many copies were downloaded, or how many times it was shared online?
The first edition, they made 1,000 copies, which took several years to sell out. The second edition was 500 copies. In 2006, second edition was in 2003. In 2006, it was put online for the first time, which is the sort of general edition. And it's really funny, nobody can figure out if it was reissued in a online new PDF version in 2015 or 2017 by Iron March, I think 15. Tens of thousands of times, maybe hundreds of thousands. There's, I think, a figure in the book that Iron March people gave and like before it folded in 2017. I'm sure hundreds of thousands. It's up to the 6th edition. Now each edition they kind of add more stuff on the end. It's up to 6 editions. It's translated into so many languages that Mason says he does not know how many translations there are. There are bridge versions of the book's like 450 pages. And like I said, it grows bigger each time. There's a 100-page version. There is the 10 Tenets of Siege. There's like a pocket version. So like you don't even need to read the whole thing. I mean, part of its appeal, I think, for neo-Nazis is like, oh, we have this really big book here. Seriously, these guys don't read it. I mean, that's absurd. It was painful to read. I mean, some of it was a bad editing job on one hand. He's not a skilled editor yet. He was like a young guy. I mean, it's impressive that he edited it, he laid it out, he published himself, he distributed it, he did that publicity. I mean, I haven't done that for a lot of that for my book. I don't begrudge his skills in that field. So a lot. There are a fucking lot of people who have read Siege around the fucking world.
As you were researching for this book specifically, who did you come across in the letters that were the most surprising to you?
Well, I knew these. Well, part of it, the most surprising letters were like Boyd Rice and Adam Parfrey. I knew these guys had some involvement because there was an article from 1999 by Kevin Coogan called "How Black is Black Metal," and he starts to he does the original groundwork showing this network, and I knew Kevin, he died while I was writing the book, and expanded a lot more. So I knew these guys were involved on some level, but I was like, wow, and I read the letters, and it was really shocked. The letters were actually in reverse chronological order, so you start on the folders from the last ones, and Parfrey's the last one, like, he's moved, and Mason can't get hold of them, and then there's just like 1 or 2, and it goes down, there's more and more, and at the bottom they get more and more racist and anti-Semitic, and he's ranting about Zog at the very bottom, and I was just like, I walked outside,
The Zionist occupation government.
yeah. I walked outside this bright, beautiful day, and I was like, shit, and I called Chip Relay, if anyone knows who he is, I was like, Jesus, you know, I'm in Kansas, do you know where I am? He's like, I know, you're at the Larry Will concert. I just found this crazy stuff. And he was like, yeah, when I went to, Chip was this, he retired recently, a longtime monitor of the far right, was a Zippy originally. And I used to work with the think tank he founded. And he was like, yeah, I spoke in Portland once, and Adam Parfrey came and disrupted my whole talk. The weirdest letter is by Greg Johnson. This is very niche stuff. Who runs the website Countercurrents. He has a PhD. He's one of the early people like who became alt-right with a PhD. It's like a more sophisticated platform. And he ended up, I wrote an article for the Southern Poverty Law Center about this. He was in contact with Mason early on, something he does not talk about now, and wrote him fawning letters saying, I'm totally on board, I love Siege. You think he was trying to butter him up. He wanted to buy the Savitri Devi like items that he had. But that was probably the weirdest. I mean, there's a huge stack of letters like this between Charles Manson and James Mason. I did not read them, mostly because Charles Manson's handwriting is almost indecipherable. And this is beyond, like, once you can read it, like, what the fuck is that guy saying? But they were tight. I mean, Manson, basically, James Mason's ideas that he develops are a reinterpretation, in a lot of them, of Charles Manson's ideas of retreating to death. Manson was a racial separatist and a vicious anti-Semite. The family was all white. It was like, again, one Jewish member who married a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. There's just some very strange stuff. And I'm going to meet with a former Manson family member, I think, who became an anarchist, Larry Giddings, if anyone knows this guy. He ends up being friends of friends. A lot of weird stuff happened in the course of writing this book, or afterwards. So Manson was a racist and an anti-Semite. There was the whole retreat to Death Valley and Helter Skelter, and then the race war, and afterwards the family would come up and take power. And this influenced James Mason's ideas a lot in Siege. So the Manson letters are the most interesting thing I would have liked to have read. Also, one more thing I found out in this group, I'd maybe vaguely known about them. The National Socialist League, it was interesting that James Mason had direct contact with the leader, Russell Vey. They were an explicitly, openly gay neo-Nazi group in California in the 70s and 80s.
So I don't, actually, let's get Elliot.
Were you about to close?
No, I was going to say something about Nancy, but please go ahead.
Well, I've been having a thought that I hadn't had before, so I have no idea whether it's how long this thought will last with me. But I've been thinking as we've been talking, what's the connection between the major events that happened here in 1988, the killing of Sarah and the Coalition for Human Dignity that my book is about, and that it did happen here, which I absolutely want to second the recommendation that came from here about that book. What's the connection between that and what Spencer is talking about and what we're seeing nationally? And I think what Spencer's talking about is a really important level that's very hard to get at. But you gave us so many examples of how things went from the sort of local collaboration, these local people, how it then got to the Village Voice, and how Adam Parfrey's obituary got to the New York Times. But there's a diffusion process. This is sort of a sociological observation, I guess, but they really are all tied together. I'm thinking that they seep from one phase to another. I'm thinking that the original, you can call them that Portland skinheads or boneheads that we all saw in the streets then, could it be that they're the equivalent of some of the MAGA people now, in the sense that they themselves are not necessarily sophisticated people? They are foot soldiers. They were foot soldiers then. And could it be that they're the analog? And then the seepage upwards, if seepage goes upwards.
Well, it's a little weird to say, because there are still neo-Nazis who do still engage in militant street activity. I mean, there's, we've seen a revival. This is a weird thing. If you remember, the first Trump administration, there really weren't almost any new neo-Nazi, explicitly National Socialist groups. The NSM was hanging around. Here's a funny thing I learned. James Mason actually co-founded the NSM in 1975. I told Jeff Scoop about how it was actually founded. So these groups are around. The weird thing that happened in 2018 when the alt-right, the proper alt-right proper went away and Spencer and Heimbach got sidelined, was that the more ideologically moderate groups became the most militant street faction than the Proud Boys did. I'm not sure there's anything particularly interesting that someone on the far right are the most militant, and that might flow back and forth like someone's gonna be. Like, this is far right politics everywhere, that there are these, like, that violence is a core part of it, that they're gonna be there. So, I don't know, I mean, they're certainly emboldened by the administrations, that's part of it, that just allows it to operate more, right? Like, when you have more rope, radicals will take that rope. That happens on the left and right, too, right? So I don't know, I'm a little wary of this. I feel like it's more like Lenny Zeskin in Blood and Politics talks about that there's a back and forth swing on the far right amongst white supremacists before, like, the entryists and the reformists like Willis Carto and David Duke and Metzger and Pierce and stuff. And so sometimes I feel like there's the same thing amongst the militants, and we saw this actually see it in the 90s, the whole wave of violent white supremacists that starts in the late 70s, really with Greensboro and running through all the Nazi skinhead stuff and the ordering stuff. By the mid-90s fades, and then the militia movement overtakes it with Oklahoma City. So if you're a right-wing dude, mostly dude, almost all dudes, not necessarily everyone, but like dudes, and you want the action in 1995, you're going to go into the militias and not into the white supremacist movement, because that's where the action's at. So I think sometimes there's just like an ebb and flow about where the most militant people are. And there's something about the far right that just, violence is such a core part of it that is not the same with or street violence that is not the same with other political traditions.
Okay, one last question, and then we're gonna wrap for the evening.
So one of the problems that came out of the 80s and 90s was our local journalism not being accountable to the community and letting bad characters get clout, and they've continued to do that. They endorsed Eric Peterson, who was a Christian nationalist, was for school board, and almost got elected to Portland. How do we hold our local papers accountable?
Well, this is a really hard problem because we now have the diffusion of a lot of these extremists across the board. and they're getting stimulated from churches and all kinds of other organizations, not limited to the Republican Party. But nobody has an answer now because we're facing with this kind of coming from all directions. But it is this institution that we're sitting in now that emerged as one of the ways in which folks got together to deal with this problem. And at least one thing I can think of, a couple of things in hand, is you should read things like this, and you should not patronize necessarily this particular institution, although that would be a good start. But other such, but others like-minded folks who can help get the word out that such and such a person is a bad actor, and to raise the consciousness of our neighbors.
So the one thing I'm going to say, and this is always a problem with doing history because there's not a one-to-one thing for the present, but involving this stuff, I think somebody, probably not me, unless someone wants to write me a grant, needs to go through what the Oregonians covered and what the Willamette Weeks covered and these other things are, and then not like go attack them online, but go to the papers and the sources and be like, we want to have a meeting with you about your coverage in the past. What are you doing about it? Have you accept responsibility? Are you going to be accountable for this? And what safeguards are you going to put in the future that this doesn't happen? I mean, if you look at the Willamette Week, there constantly is this undercurrent of this stuff. I reread the Tim Calvert article from a number of years ago. I was like, wow, they're still like against people calling Nazis out. They really are overly critical of them. And I think that is, for a mainstream institution, for whatever that's worth these days. I mean, I feel like people on the far right are ignoring standard media sources, so I'm not sure we're gonna like infiltrate their silo of lies and just concentrate on conspiracy theories. But for the bigger sources, I think it is worth an attempt to sit down with them.
And Oregon Public Broadcasting too.
No shit.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, thank you both. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Spencer.